There are so many stories and weird stuff out there about the infamous occultist Aleister Crowley. Most of it, however, you find online is completely low effort and completely made up, which is really disappointing. People just don't fact check or really care. But if you actually read his work, you find some absolute gems in there. And this guy was a super freak, sometimes in delightful ways and sometimes in disgusting and horrifying ways. So the story I'm going to tell you today is in honor of this sort of winter spooky season, and it's all about how Aleister Crowley had a pet human skeleton and he tried to reanimate it. It comes right from Aleister Crowley himself, from his confessions, and it occupies, in my opinion, one of these categories of kind of endearing, but also completely disgusting. So this is your content warning going into the story. I will be talking about weird and gross things, so if you don't want to hear about that, please click away. But before you get into it, let me tell you a little bit about myself and why I am talking today to you all. Okay, so why am I talking to you all about weird, spooky, occult stuff? So, hey everyone, for those who do not know me, my name is Mavis Lynn. I am a practicing occultist and ceremonial magician, and I like exploring things from an academic and scholarly perspective, but also from a practitioner perspective. So I dive deep into things with academic rigor, but also as someone who is a practitioner, and I love to bring you little bits of history and little bit of conversations around all things academic, Western esoteric, and magical. So let's get into this story. In order to get the most out of this story, let's talk about the main character of this story first, Aleister Crowley. He is one of the most notorious and misunderstood occultists in history. To be very honest, I have no interest in telling you how to feel about him. Love, hate, apathy, that is entirely up to you. Feel your feelings. However, I am very interested in providing you with an accurate account of facts grounded in reality, so that you are empowered to make up your own mind about the events of this story and him as a person. And as a side note, with regards to the picture on your screen, most people get this wrong, and that's because they're not familiar with Thelemic magic or Aleister Crowley himself. But the garment he is wearing in that picture is actually a hood, and it's a ritual garment used in his magical teaching order, the AA. It is not a hat, and I just like to let people know little facts like that. Aleister Crowley lived a colorful and controversial life. He was a world traveler, mountain climber, poet, spy, writer, yogi, philosopher, painter, occultist, and a prophet of a new religious movement. He was relentlessly painted as a villain during his life. Some of the hostility he experienced throughout his life came from the fact he was an iconoclast and didn't fit the mold of respectable Victorian Christian society. He was a promiscuous, queer, and kinky man at a time when that could land you in jail. As a queer man, he forged a path forward and made sense of the world using the occult. His lifelong study and discoveries made in the occult were a sharp deviation from the very strict Christian fundamentalist group he was raised in, known as the Plymouth Brethren. Crowley was a voracious reader and eventually became very skeptical of Christianity, which led to his exploration into Buddhism and initiation into the occult secret society known as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. If you would like to read more about Aleister Crowley, I recommend you do. And here are some book suggestions. Books can go into a lot more detail and nuance than a simple YouTube video, so consider this your invitation to dive deeper. The source of today's story comes from the Confessions of Aleister Crowley, which was on the recommended reading list on the last page. Side note, like everything Crowley wrote, you need to be aware that he uses outdated language that some would consider offensive. I personally don't want to get demonetized or be offensive in that way. I want to focus on the content, so I've chosen to censor that, but unlike other people, I provide you with the actual source, and I encourage you to go look that up, read about it, and educate yourself, and come to your own conclusion. In the Confessions, he writes, "During this time, magical phenomena were of constant occurrence. I had 2 temples in my flat. One white, the walls being lined with 6 huge mirrors, each 6 feet by 8, the other black. A mere cupboard in which stood an altar supported by a figure standing on his hands. The presiding genius of this place was a human skeleton, which I fed from time to time with blood, small birds, and the like. The idea was to give it life, but I never got further than causing the bones to become covered with a viscous slime. The additional context of this story is that Crowley was a student at Trinity College, Cambridge around this time. He was a member of the occult order we previously mentioned, called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and his roommate was Alan Bennett, who was also a member of the Golden Dawn. As you can imagine, their living space was probably very magical and reflected their beliefs and interests. Crowley describes them having 2 temples, one black and one white. This idea of having opposites, up, down, black, white, is very common in the ceremonial magic they were practicing. It's considered good practice to have a balanced temple space, a balanced ritual, and in this case, 2 different rituals to balance each other. And this idea of balance in symmetry is very important. Crowley says that the Black Temple was not really used, but then he goes on to describe his efforts in the space to reanimate a skeleton. And what he did with that skeleton was really weird. So this is the part of the video where I begin to speculate and read between the lines. Crowley was a master at hiding some of his more wild things behind euphemisms, so I think this kind of speculation is valid. And also remember the time he wrote this was the Victorian era, so there was a lot of concern around modesty, and he veiled that in his language he used. So, first of all, Victorians at this time were obsessed with death. This is the point in time which they were having mummy unwrapping parties in people's homes, and they were also eating mummies. Mummies and skeletons were sometimes displayed in homes, so it makes sense that Crowley was able to get his hands on one. The fact Crowley had a skeleton was not a wild part of the story. The wild part of the story was the fact he tried to bring it back to life. Crowley was very interested in the regenerative nature of magic and spirituality. It makes sense he would carry this interest into trying to reanimate a human skeleton. He says that he was trying to do this with blood and small birds and, quote, the like. What is the like? What else was he shoving into or onto the skeleton? And quite frankly, who knows? But I do know Crowley often referred to ejaculate as blood. So it's possible that this particular substance he was putting into or onto the skeleton was ejaculate and not just human blood. Another consideration is how exactly was Crowley applying this or inserting it into the skeleton? You would imagine if he was feeding the skeleton small birds and substances through the skeleton's mouth, it would just fall through the skeleton. There's not really anything to keep it on the bones to produce what he describes as this viscous substance. So I don't know. Maybe he was tying the birds to the bones. I don't know what he was doing. Maybe there was more to this. Well, of course there's more. Another point in favor of the blood being more than just blood is that Crowley describes the skeleton as becoming slimy. Speaking from personal experience as a person who menstruates, blood when it dries becomes crusty, not slimy. It does not make a viscous slime when it's dried out and sitting there a while, so he would have had to have added more to this blood, possibly, as we previously mentioned, ejaculate, which he believed to be a magical ingredient with regenerative powers. It makes sense that that could have made it into the substances he was feeding the skeleton. Let's take that a bit further. How was he producing or procuring these substances? Did his roommate, the respectable Alan Bennett, help? Were the 2 of them romantically involved with each other? Now, let's be clear here. There is absolutely no evidence that they did these sort of things together. I'm speaking of the romantic possible things they were doing. But they were roommates who shared the residence with a rotting, slimy skeleton. And I mean, it's possible. Also, take a moment to imagine the smell of a human skeleton full of dead birds and other, let's just say, organic substances. How did they get away with keeping something like that? Did the neighbors ever notice or complain? Or was this just normal Victorian stuff where people were doing weird stuff and it just generally smelled bad and blended in with the rest of the aroma of Victorian society? Something to think about. Of course, Aleister Crowley was never able to reanimate that skeleton. The thing just ultimately sat there and got nasty over time. Nothing happened, and perhaps nothing happened for the better. I know when I die, personally, I don't want anyone to bring me back with dead birds and substances. No thank you. I think this strange story is not just a reflection of Crowley's optimism that he could cure something so totally final like death, but also the Victorian era's fascination with all things morbid. They were just doing some weird things at that time period with death and mummies and all of these memento moris. I think it's easy for us to judge such things from our modern perspective. But ultimately, as human beings, we're still human. We aren't special. We're no different. We will be judged by history just as harshly for our own weirdness as we judge them. What things do you think history will remember us for and look down on us for? I know I can think of a few. And I leave you with this additional question. What skeleton do you think we are trying to revive that is destined to disgust future generations? Thank you so much for joining me all today. I hope you found it interesting and fun. What a great excuse to dive into a little bit of history. If you enjoyed this, go check out my other YouTube channels and follow me elsewhere on social media. I always put my links down below. I also have a Patreon if you want to join me for a book club or a little bit of extra discussion and extra content. Also, I am a writer and I have an upcoming book. It's currently available for pre-order, coming out in May 2026. So hope you all join me there, and thank you again for watching. I am the center of expression for the primal will to good, and so are you.